She ran a $1 billion company. He fixed pipes for $45 a job. She spent her days in boardrooms high up in a skyscraper. He spent his under kitchen sinks. They never should have met. But one quiet morning in a roadside diner, something happened that neither of them saw coming, and the one who had nothing became the only person willing to stand up for the one who had everything. This is not a love story. It's something harder to name. Derek Brooks had been coming to May's Diner every morning for a long time. Same booth by the window, same order, black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast. The waitress, Betty, stopped asking what he wanted a long time ago. She just brought it. It was the only part of his day that belonged entirely to him. He'd drop his daughter Lily off at Willow Creek Elementary until she disappeared through the double doors, then drive his work van to whatever job was on the schedule. Leaking faucets, burst pipes, clogged drains in apartment buildings where the landlords never answered the phone but always expected the bill to be low. Derek was a plumber, not the kind with a company name on the van. Just the kind people called when they couldn't afford anyone else. He didn't mind the work. What he minded was everything around it. The way clients sometimes watched him a little too carefully when he walked through their homes. The way certain contractors talked to him like he should be grateful for the scraps they threw his way. He'd learned early that being a black man in a blue-collar world meant keeping your voice, even your eyes down, and your opinions to yourself. It wasn't dignity, it was math. Every confrontation cost something. Every time he stood out, something got taken away. So he stayed small, and most days small was enough. But his daughter had looked up from her coloring book at the kitchen table and asked him a question he still hadn't shaken off. Daddy, if someone's being mean to somebody and you walk past, are you supposed to help? She was 7. She asked it the way 7-year-olds ask everything, like the answer should be obvious and she just needed a grown-up to confirm it. Derek had opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He told her it was bedtime. Now he sat in his booth at May's, turning that silence over in his mind. And he hated the taste of it more than the burned coffee Betty always poured too hot. The woman was already at the counter when he walked in. He noticed her the way you notice someone who doesn't quite fit. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything about her was too composed. She sat alone. No phone on the counter, no bag on the stool beside her, just a cup of coffee held with both hands, her back straight, her gaze somewhere past the window. She wore a plain olive jacket faded at the elbows and a pair of running shoes that had seen some miles. Nothing about her screamed money, but there was something in the way she held herself. The kind of stillness that didn't come from being relaxed, but from being very, very practiced at control. She thanked Betty when the coffee came. Not a casual thanks, a precise one. The kind of politeness that sounded like it had been repeated 10,000 times in rooms far more important than this one. Betty didn't notice. Derek did, though he couldn't have told you why. He also caught the watch on her left wrist. Simple face, leather band, no flash. But the way the metal caught the fluorescent light told him it wasn't from any store he'd ever walked into. He didn't know watches. He just knew when something was quietly expensive. None of it mattered. She was a stranger having coffee. He was a plumber having eggs. The morning was ordinary, and ordinary was all he ever asked for. Then the door opened and ordinary left. 2 officers walked in, not for breakfast. The taller one, blonde, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, scanned the room like he was looking for someone who owed him something. His partner, stockier, hands already on his belt, headed straight for the counter, straight for her. Ma'am. The stocky one planted himself 2 feet from her stool. You got some ID on you? The woman looked up, her expression didn't change. May I ask why? Just a routine check. We got a call about someone unfamiliar in the area. He said unfamiliar the way people say it when they mean something else entirely. She reached slowly into her jacket pocket and produced a driver's license. The officer took it, studied it far longer than necessary, then handed it to his partner, who studied it even longer. Where are you coming from this morning? The blonde one asked. He'd moved closer now, standing at an angle that blocked her from the rest of the diner as though the conversation was private. It wasn't. Everyone could hear. I drove here, she said, nothing more. From where? From my home. And where's that? She told them an address. The blonde officer raised an eyebrow. That's a 40-minute drive, long way to come for diner coffee. She didn't explain, she didn't apologize, she just looked at him with eyes that were steady and absolutely unreadable, the kind of calm that infuriates people who are used to making others nervous. Derek watched from his booth, his eggs were getting cold, his hands were flat on the table. He knew this scene. He'd lived it in different bodies, different diners, different parking lots at different hours of the night. The questions that weren't really questions, the standing too close that wasn't really about safety, the tone that said, I need you to know that I'm in charge here and you are not. And the woman, she handled it the way Derek's mother used to handle their landlord when he showed up unannounced, talking too loud, standing in the doorway so she couldn't close the door. His mother would go quiet, not scared quiet, enduring quiet, the kind of silence that says, I know what this is and I've decided it's not worth my blood. He saw that same silence in this stranger, and it hit something inside him that he'd spent years trying to bury. Betty was wiping down a table in the back, eyes fixed on the rag. The old man in the corner booth stared at his newspaper like the words had suddenly become fascinating. A young couple near the door exchanged a glance, then looked at their phones. Nobody moved. Derek thought about Lily, about her question, about the empty space where his answer should have been. He thought about what he would tell her if she asked again, and he had to say, I was there, and I did nothing. His chair scraped against the floor before he fully decided to stand. He didn't walk fast, he didn't puff his chest, he just crossed the diner with the steady gait of a man who fixes things for a living and walked toward the counter the way he'd walk toward a broken pipe, because it needed to be dealt with, not because he wanted to. Excuse me, officers. His voice was calm, unremarkable. She's just having breakfast. Been sitting there quiet since before I got here. The blonde officer turned. Up close, he was younger than Derek expected, with the kind of jaw that tightened when someone spoke out of turn. Sir, this doesn't concern you. I know it doesn't, Derek said. I'm just saying what I saw. She came in, ordered coffee, hasn't bothered anybody. The stocky officer looked at Derek, really looked at him, eyes traveling from his work boots to his calloused hands to his face. Derek recognized that look too. The calculation, the measuring, deciding whether this man was a threat or just a nuisance. Derek held still. He didn't fold his arms, didn't raise his voice. He stood there the way a tree stands, not because it's trying to prove something, but because that's where its roots are. The blonde officer glanced at his partner. Something unspoken passed between them. Then the stocky one handed the woman her license back, almost tossing it onto the counter. Have a good morning, he said in a voice that wished her nothing of the sort. They left. The bell above the door chimed twice, once on the way out, once as the door swung back and settled. The diner exhaled. Betty reappeared. The old man turned a page. The young couple started talking again. Derek stood there for a moment longer, his heart drumming against his ribs, his hands tingling the way they did after he gripped a wrench too hard for too long. He became aware suddenly of how visible he was, standing in the middle of the diner. A black man who had just inserted himself between a stranger and two cops. Every instinct he'd trained into himself over 34 years told him the same thing it had always told him. That was expensive. That's going to cost you. He turned back toward his booth. The woman's eyes followed him. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She looked at him the way you look at something you didn't expect to find. Not with gratitude, but with a kind of recognition. The look of someone who had walked into 100 rooms full of people and never once had a stranger stand up for them without wanting something in return. Derek didn't see all of that. He just saw a woman who looked tired and relieved, and something else he couldn't name. He sat down, picked up his fork. His eggs were cold. He ate them anyway. Across the counter, the woman lifted her coffee cup. Her fingers wrapped around the ceramic were perfectly still. But if Derek had been closer, he might have noticed the faintest tremor running through them, the kind that comes not from fear, but from the sudden, unfamiliar weight of being seen by someone who expected nothing. She didn't know his name. He didn't know hers. And in the quiet of that small diner on a morning in the Chicago suburbs, that was exactly enough. The diner settled back into its rhythm, but the air still carried the weight of what had just happened, the way a room holds the echo of a slammed door long after it's closed. Derek stared at his plate. The eggs had gone rubbery, the toast stiff. He chewed mechanically, tasting nothing. His hands were steady now, but something beneath his sternum hadn't stopped vibrating. A low hum of adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. He wanted to leave. Every instinct told him to pay his bill, walk out, get in his van, and drive to work like nothing happened, because that was how it worked. You stand up, you sit back down, and then you disappear before anyone remembers your face. He signaled Betty for the check. She brought it without looking at him, which told him everything he needed to know. She'd seen what happened and wanted no part of it, not even the part that came after. At the counter, the woman set her coffee cup down. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a folded bill, and placed it beneath the saucer with the kind of deliberate neatness that people use when they're trying to hold themselves together through small, controllable actions. Then she stood up. Derek kept his eyes on his plate. He wasn't going to look at her. He'd done what he'd done, and that was the end of it. He didn't need thanks. He didn't want a conversation. He didn't want to become part of whatever her story was because his own story was complicated enough. But she walked past his booth on her way to the door, and she stopped. Not in front of him, just beside the table, close enough that he could see the running shoes from the corner of his eye, scuffed along the left sole, the laces double knotted. "The coffee here," she said. Her voice was different now, softer than it had been with the officers, but still measured, still careful. "Is it always this bad?" Derek looked up. She was standing with her hands in her jacket pockets, her weight shifted to one foot, the posture of someone ready to leave at any second but choosing not to, just for a moment. "It's not great," he said, "but the pancakes are worse." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, the kind that surfaces when you haven't laughed in a while and your muscles have almost forgotten how. "Good to know," she said. "Good to..." She didn't ask his name, didn't offer hers, didn't mention the cops or what he'd done or why he'd done it. And Derek was grateful for that because he didn't have an answer that would have made sense to either of them. She glanced toward the window where the morning light was cutting across the parking lot in long, flat stripes. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't making a decision," she said, almost to herself. "It's living with the one you already made." Derek didn't respond right away. The sentence landed in a place he wasn't expecting, somewhere between his daughter's question and his cold eggs this morning. He didn't understand why a stranger in a diner would say something that heavy over bad coffee, but he felt the weight behind it the way you feel thunder before you hear it. "Yeah," he said, "I guess that's true." She nodded once, the way people nod when they've said more than they intended and need to stop. Then she walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the pale morning. The bell chimed, the door settled, and she was gone. Derek sat there for another minute, staring at the space where she'd stood. Then he paid his bill, left a tip Betty didn't deserve this morning, and drove to work. He thought about her once during the drive, not about who she was or where she'd come from, but about the way she'd said that sentence, like she was carrying something she couldn't put down. And for one moment she'd let a stranger see the shape of it. Then he turned on the radio, and the thought dissolved into traffic. The call came. Derek was under a kitchen sink in a duplex on Oak Street, replacing a corroded P-trap, when his phone buzzed in his back pocket. He wiped his hands on his jeans and answered. It was Mike Harlan. Mike ran a small contracting outfit that fed Derek most of his steady work. Apartment turnovers, bathroom remodels, the kind of jobs that weren't glamorous but kept the lights on. Derek had been counting on Mike's next project, a 12-unit building on Lakeview that needed full repiping. It was the biggest job of the month, maybe the quarter, weeks of guaranteed work. Derek, listen. Mike's voice had the careful tone of a man rehearsing bad news. I'm going to have to go a different direction on the Lakeview job. Derek sat up, his back against the cabinet. Different direction? How? I got some feedback. People in that building, the property manager, they're a little uncomfortable. Uncomfortable with what? Mike didn't answer right away. The silence on the line said everything. His words were trying not to. Mike, Derek said, keeping his voice level. What did you hear? I heard you got into it with some cops at Mays, that you stepped to them over some woman. Look, Derek, I'm not saying you did anything wrong. I'm just saying the property manager doesn't want any complications. You know how it is. Derek did know. He knew exactly how it was. He'd known how it was when he was 12, and his mother lost her cleaning job because she'd asked her employer to stop leaving cash on the counter and accusing her of stealing it. He'd known how it was when he was 22 and a foreman told him he had an attitude because he'd asked to be paid for overtime he'd already worked. He knew that in his world, standing up and standing out were the same thing, and both came with a price. I understand, Derek said, because that was what he always said, not because he agreed, but because arguing with Mike Harlan would cost him the next job too, and the one after that. He finished the P-trap, collected his $45, drove to Willow Creek Elementary to pick up Lily. She came out with a drawing, a purple house with a yellow sun and two stick figures holding hands. That's me and you, Daddy, she said, climbing into the van. Derek looked at the drawing and felt something crack open in his chest that he couldn't fix with any tool he owned. That night, after Lily fell asleep with her arm around a stuffed elephant named Gerald, Derek sat at the kitchen table and did the numbers. Without the Lakeview job, he was short on rent by the end of the month. He could pick up smaller gigs, leaky faucets, running toilets, the kinds of calls that paid $40 or $50 and ate up half a day in drive time. Or he could take night shifts doing maintenance at the Riverside Plaza strip mall, mopping floors and checking locks. He chose the night shifts. He chose them the way he chose everything, quietly, without complaint, because Lily needed to eat and the electricity needed to stay on, and there was no one else to make those choices for him. He didn't regret standing up in the diner. That was the part that kept circling back to him while he pushed a mop down empty hallways. He'd expected to regret it. He'd braced himself for the familiar bitterness of doing something right and getting punished for it, but the regret never came. What came instead was something harder to name, a low, stubborn certainty that if he had to do it again, he would. And that scared him more than the lost contract because it meant the rules he'd lived by were starting to crack. She drove back to May's Diner. She didn't plan to. She'd spent the week in conference rooms and board meetings, surrounded by people who called her by her last name and brought her decisions to sign the way waiters bring a check. Her corner office on the 37th floor of the Pinnacle Corporate Tower in downtown Chicago overlooked the entire city. From up there, everything looked manageable, organized, small. But she hadn't felt manageable or organized or small since that morning in a diner where a man she didn't know stood up for her without being asked. She wasn't looking for him. She was looking for the feeling she'd had sitting at that counter, the feeling of being nobody, of drinking bad coffee in a place where no one knew her net worth or her quarterly earnings, or the fact that 1 week earlier she'd signed a restructuring deal that would eliminate 2,000 jobs across 3 subsidiaries. She'd signed it because the numbers demanded it, because the board demanded it, because the shareholders demanded it. And then she'd driven 40 minutes to the edge of the suburbs and sat in a diner and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a position. She'd found it briefly, and then 2 cops had taken it away. Now she was back. Same stool at the counter, same olive jacket. Betty poured her coffee and set it down with a look that said she remembered exactly who this woman was and had decided not to bring it up. That suited her fine. The diner was quiet. A few regulars, no cops, no Derek. A man 2 stools down, older, wearing a trucker cap and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, was talking to Betty about the weather, about his truck, about everything and nothing. Then his voice dipped the way people's voices do when they shift from small talk to gossip. "You hear about Derek the plumber?" Betty kept wiping the counter. "What about him?" "Lost that big Lakeview job. Harlan dropped him. Somebody told the property manager he got into trouble with the law." The man shook his head. "It wasn't even trouble. He just said something to those cops who were bothering that lady in here. But you know how it goes. Word gets around and it's never the version that's true." Betty said nothing. She moved down the counter and refilled the woman's cup without making eye contact. The woman stared at the coffee. A little girl, a lost contract because he'd stood up for a woman whose name he didn't even know. She felt the familiar machinery of her mind begin to turn. She could fix this. One phone call to her chief of staff, a referral to a facilities manager, an anonymous grant through one of Summit's community programs. She had 17 different ways to make this man's problem disappear before lunch, but she didn't reach for her phone because she recognized what she was doing. It was the same thing she did in every boardroom, every crisis, every negotiation. Identify the problem, deploy the solution, move on. It was efficient. It was effective. And it was, she understood now, a way of turning people into projects. If she fixed Derek's life from behind a screen, she wouldn't be helping him. She'd be managing him. And the distance between those two things was the distance between kindness and control. So she drank her coffee, she left a 20 under the saucer, and she drove back to the city carrying the weight of something she'd chosen not to do, which felt heavier than any deal she'd ever closed. Derek found out on a Thursday night. He was at the Riverside Plaza halfway through his shift, eating a sandwich from the vending machine in the break room. The small television mounted in the corner was tuned to a business channel, not his choice. The maintenance supervisor kept it there, and Derek usually ignored it the way he ignored everything that didn't directly involve pipes or his daughter. But tonight, a face on the screen stopped him mid-bite. The woman from the diner. She was standing behind a podium in a black suit, her hair pulled back, her posture straight as a blade. The same composure, the same stillness, but everything else was different. Behind her, the logo of a company called Summit Technologies glowed in clean white letters. A ticker ran across the bottom of the screen. Summit CEO Rachel Morgan announces completion of $4.7 billion acquisition. $4.7 billion. Derek set his sandwich down. He stared at the screen. The woman on television spoke with measured authority about synergies and market expansion and shareholder value. She answered questions from reporters with the same unreadable calm she'd used on the cops in the diner. Her watch, the simple one on her left wrist, caught the light from the podium lamps, and Derek remembered thinking it was quietly expensive. Now he knew how quiet. He thought about the way she'd thanked Betty, that precise, practiced politeness. He thought about the sentence she'd said on her way out about living with decisions. He thought about her olive jacket and her scuffed running shoes and the way she'd stood by his table with her hands in her pockets like she was just another person having a bad morning. None of it was a lie, but none of it was the whole truth either. The anchor moved on to another story. Derek picked up his sandwich but didn't eat it. He sat there in the break room with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and looked at his hands, calloused, scarred along the knuckles. Hands that had never signed anything worth more than a work order. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel tricked. He felt what he always felt when the world reminded him of its true dimensions, a quiet, familiar smallness. Not shame, just proportion. She lived in a world of billion-dollar deals and press conferences and board meetings. He lived in a world of leaking pipes and night shifts and vending machine sandwiches. She hadn't needed his protection. She'd needed it less than anyone he'd ever met, and yet she'd sat there letting two cops push into her space without once reaching for the kind of power that could have ended that conversation in 5 seconds. He didn't understand that. He wasn't sure he wanted to. What he understood was simpler, and it settled into him like cold water. Her world was not his world. It never would be. And whatever had passed between them in that diner, that small, nameless thing, belonged to a morning that was already gone. Derek finished his shift. He drove home in the dark. He checked on Lily, who was asleep with Gerald tucked under her chin. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, listening to her breathe, and told himself that this quiet house, this sleeping child, this ordinary life was enough. It had to be. 2 weeks passed. Derek stopped looking for the Lakeview job to come back. He stopped calculating what he'd lost and started counting what he still had, which was less, but enough to keep going if he was careful. The night shifts at Riverside Plaza wore on him. He'd get home, shower, make Lily breakfast, drive her to Willow Creek Elementary, then sleep until the afternoon. The sleep was thin, the kind that left him more tired than when he lay down. But the checks cleared, and the refrigerator stayed full, and Lily never knew anything had changed. He thought about Rachel Morgan less than he expected, not because he'd forgotten, but because thinking about her led to a place he'd already decided not to go. She existed on a screen now, in a world measured in billions, and he existed here under fluorescent lights pushing a mop. The morning in the diner felt like something that had happened to a different version of himself, one who'd briefly stepped outside the boundaries he'd drawn around his life, and then stepped back in. What stayed with him wasn't her. It was the question of whether he'd do it again, and the answer, stubborn and inconvenient, was always yes. One evening before his shift, Derek was helping Lily with her spelling words at the kitchen table. She was writing each word 3 times in her composition book, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth the way it always did when she concentrated. "Daddy," she said, not looking up from her book, "I told Tyler Briggs to stop pushing Emma at recess today." Derek set down the glass he was drying. "You did?" He was being mean. He kept taking her jump rope and she was crying. Lily wrote the word friend in careful block letters. So I walked over and said, "That's not yours, give it back," and he did. "Were you scared?" Lily thought about it with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to a question about fear. "A little. Tyler's bigger than me, but Emma was crying." She shrugged as if that explained everything. Derek stood at the kitchen counter with the dish towel in his hands and felt something shift inside him. Not breaking, not healing, just settling into a new position, like a bone that had been set wrong and was finally finding its true alignment. He'd spent years teaching his daughter to keep her head down, to stay small, to avoid the kind of attention that turned into consequences, and she'd listened to all of it, absorbed every word, and then walked across a playground to stand up for a girl with a jump rope because it was the right thing to do. And her heart was too big for the cage he'd built around her. She hadn't learned that from his words. She'd learned it from a morning in a diner that she knew nothing about. "I'm proud of you, Lil," he said. She smiled without looking up and kept writing. That night, pushing his mop down the empty corridor of the strip mall, Derek made a decision he didn't fully understand. He decided to stop punishing himself for the diner. Not to celebrate it, not to turn it into a story he told himself about being brave, just to let it be what it was. A moment where he'd done something that felt right, and it had cost him, and he'd survived the cost. That was all. He didn't need it to be more than that. For the first time in weeks, the hum beneath his sternum went quiet. Rachel Morgan sat in her office on the 37th floor and stared at a name on her screen. She'd looked Derek up, not through private investigators or security teams, just a simple search, the kind anyone could do. She found his business listing on a trade directory. Brooks Plumbing Services, 1 phone number, no website, a service area covering the south side and surrounding suburbs. She also found what she'd been afraid of finding, a review from a property manager on Lakeview posted after the diner incident. Unreliable, would not recommend. 2 sentences that carried the weight of a lie dressed up as an opinion. The machinery in her mind started turning again. She could call the property manager directly. She could have Summit's legal team send a letter. She could make Mike Harlan's contracting business very uncomfortable with a single conversation. She had the power to reach into Derek Brooks's life and rearrange it like furniture in a room. And the terrifying part was how natural that impulse felt. But she thought about the way he'd stood in that diner. No demands, no negotiation, no expectation of return. He'd simply seen something wrong and moved toward it, and then he'd sat back down and eaten his cold eggs. If she intervened the way she knew how, directly, visibly, decisively, she would turn his act of decency into a transaction. She would become the powerful woman who rewarded the man who helped her, and he would become the man who was rewarded for helping a powerful woman. The thing that had made that morning matter, the fact that neither of them knew who the other was, that neither of them wanted anything, would be gone. But doing nothing wasn't right either. She'd sat with that choice for days now, and the weight hadn't gotten lighter. Choosing not to help wasn't the same as respecting someone's dignity, not when the harm he'd suffered existed because of her. There had to be a space between controlling his life and abandoning it, between being a CEO and being a person. She just had to find it. It took her 3 days. Summit Technologies leased office space in 11 buildings across the metro area. One of them, a mid-rise on Elm Street, had a facilities management contract that was up for renewal. Rachel spoke to her operations director not about Derek, but about the company's vendor diversity initiative, which she'd signed into policy 2 years ago and which the operations team had largely ignored. "I want local contractors in the pipeline," she told him. "Small businesses, sole proprietors, the kind of people who actually live in the neighborhoods where we lease space. Get me a list by Friday." The operations director compiled the list. Among dozens of names pulled from trade directories and service databases, Derek Brooks appeared, not because anyone placed him there, but because he'd been registered in the directory for years, and his service area covered Elm Street. The facilities manager at the Elm Street building, a man named Tom Weber, called Derek the following Monday. "Mr. Brooks, I'm looking for a plumber for a long-term maintenance contract, 12 months, weekly inspections, on call for emergencies. Got your name from a contractor database. You interested?" Derek, sitting in his van outside Willow Creek Elementary, waiting for Lily, almost asked Weber to repeat himself. 12 months of steady work, the kind of contract he'd been chasing for years and never landing. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm interested." He signed the paperwork that week. The pay wasn't extravagant. It was fair, which was more than he was used to. It meant he could drop the night shifts at Riverside Plaza. It meant he could sleep in a bed instead of on his feet. It meant he could take Lily to the park on Saturday afternoons instead of collapsing on the couch while she watched cartoons alone. He didn't know why the call had come. He figured that sometimes after a long stretch of bad luck, something just breaks your way. He didn't question it. He'd spent too much of his life questioning good things when they arrived, waiting for the catch, and he was tired of living like that. The world hadn't suddenly become kind, but a small corner of it had shifted just enough, and he let himself stand in the space it made. A Saturday morning in early fall, the air had turned cool, carrying the smell of dry leaves and someone's fireplace from down the block. Derek sat in his usual booth at Mays. Beside him, Lily knelt on the vinyl seat, drawing on a paper napkin with a crayon she'd pulled from her jacket pocket. She was working on something elaborate, a building with dozens of windows, each one containing a tiny face. "That's a lot of people," Derek said, sipping his coffee. "It's an apartment," Lily explained. "Everybody lives there, even the dog." The bell above the door chimed. Derek looked up. The woman who walked in wore a familiar olive jacket, faded at the elbows, and a pair of running shoes that had seen more miles since the last time he'd noticed them. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders. No podium, no press cameras, no $4.7 billion ticker crawling across the bottom of a screen. Just a woman walking into a diner on a Saturday morning alone. Their eyes met. There was no surprise in it. More like the feeling of turning a corner and finding something exactly where you left it. Derek gave a small nod, the kind men give each other across parking lots and waiting rooms. Simple. No weight to it. Rachel returned it with a smile so faint it barely moved her mouth, but it reached her eyes in a way that the cameras on business channels would never capture. She sat down at the counter, not at Derek's booth, not across from him, at the counter, one stool over from where she'd sat that morning. The distance was deliberate, and it was kind. Betty brought her coffee without being asked. Rachel wrapped both hands around the cup the same way she had on the morning they first crossed paths. Lily looked up from her napkin. She studied the woman at the counter with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is impolite. "Daddy," Lily whispered, though her whisper carried across half the diner. "Does that lady eat by herself too?" Derek looked at his daughter, then at Rachel, whose shoulders had tensed just slightly, the way a person's body reacts when they hear something they weren't meant to hear but needed to. He didn't answer Lily's question. Instead, he lifted his voice just enough to cross the small distance between the booth and the counter. "The pancakes are still terrible," he said, "but the coffee is all right today." Rachel didn't turn around, but her shoulders dropped and the tension left them. And Derek could tell she was smiling the way you can always tell, not from the face, but from the change in the air around a person. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Lily, satisfied that the adults had established communication, went back to drawing. She added another window to her apartment building, and inside it, she drew two stick figures, sitting across from each other at a small table. The diner hummed with its ordinary sounds, coffee pouring, plates clinking, Betty calling an order to the kitchen. Outside, a car pulled into the lot and a family climbed out, arguing cheerfully about who had forgotten the coupons. The television above the counter played a college football game that nobody was watching. Derek drank his coffee. Rachel drank hers. Between them, the silence was not empty. It was the kind of quiet that exists between two people who have seen each other clearly once in a moment that ask nothing of either of them and who have carried that moment carefully the way you carry a glass of water across a dark room, trying not to spill it. They didn't talk about power or money or the distance between their lives. They didn't mention the morning or the cops or the cold eggs or the contract that was lost or the one that was found. They just sat there. A plumber and a billionaire, a father and a woman learning how not to fix everything. Two people who had been alone for a long time, discovering that the world could be a little softer when someone understood you even just once, even without a word. And that was enough. You know, most people think courage looks like a big moment, a speech, a fight, a dramatic stand against impossible odds. But sometimes it looks like a man putting down his fork and standing up in a quiet diner, even though he knows exactly what it's going to cost him. Sometimes kindness isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, it just shows up in the right place at the right time and changes the shape of someone's world without either person realizing it. Derek didn't get a reward. Rachel didn't get a savior, they just got a reminder that none of us are as alone as we think if we're willing to look up from our own plates once in a while. Maybe that's the thing worth carrying with you today. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone you could stand up for, or someone who once stood up for you, then take a second and subscribe. Hit that button. Not for me, not for the algorithm, just so the next story like this one can find its way to someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like Derek and Rachel's happen every day. Most of them just never get told. I'll see you in the next one. You know, as I sit here thinking about Derek and Rachel's story, my chest actually tightens because it reminds me of something we all feel in our bones but rarely say out loud. The most powerful thing any of us can do is stand up for someone when it costs us everything and we expect nothing back. Derek didn't know she was a billionaire CEO. He just saw a woman being pushed around in that little Chicago diner. And even though every instinct told him it would wreck his paycheck, his safety, his whole careful world, he still got up from those cold eggs and spoke. That quiet courage didn't come with applause or a reward. It came with lost jobs and sleepless nights and the heavy knowledge that doing right might break what he'd worked so hard to hold together. Yet in the end, it cracked open something bigger than either of them planned, a moment of real human seeing that no boardroom or bank account could buy. And Rachel, she could have fixed his life with one phone call, but she chose the harder path, respecting his dignity instead of managing him like another problem to solve. That's the lesson that wrecks me every time. True kindness isn't loud or flashy. It's choosing to be decent when no one's watching, even when the world tries to punish you for it. It's remembering that the stranger across the counter might be carrying a burden you'll never understand and still choosing to show up anyway. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you remember a time you stood up for someone or a time someone stood up for you when they didn't have to, drop it in the comments right now. Tell me your story. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, stories that actually matter, hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you never miss the next one. Your support keeps these tales alive for the next person who needs to hear them. I'll see you in the next story, friend.